employing his trademark Duterte Harry swagger in an off-the-cuff remark that shocked many. Let's take a listen.
If you go down, I go down. But for this martial law and the consequences of martial law and the ramifications of martial law, I and I alone would be responsible. Trabaho lang kayo. Panabala. Ako na ang magpakulong sa inyo. Pag nagka-rape ka ng tatlo, aminin ko na akin yun.
Richard Duterte, what are the consequences of a remark like that one? In the Philippines, it's shaping up like a defining moment of Rodrigo Duterte's presidency. As ISIS militants find themselves on the back foot in Syria and Iraq, could they really be trying to carve out territory in Southeast Asia? Militants who've been fighting a decades-long insurgency, storming Marawi city in the south and flying the black flag of Islamic State. This after the army tried to arrest one of their commanders last week. After recent attacks in Indonesia and Malaysia, the Philippines, a Catholic-majority nation, becoming a magnet for Islamic State militants. The fighting has proved tough. 90% of residents have fled, and while the Senate has now backed the decision by Duterte to impose 60 days of martial law for the South, the president also floating the idea of perhaps an extension to the entire nation. Would such an extension be warranted? Supporters of Duterte insist it's in no way an excuse to follow in the footsteps of the Marcos dictatorship, which cracked down for more than a decade in the 70s and 80s thanks to martial law. Critics don't see it that way, and they also fail to see the funny side of Duterte's quip about letting soldiers on the government side get away with rape. How does the commander-in-chief restore authority at a time when he's trying to negotiate with other militant groups? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at the prospect of martial law under Duterte. With us from Manila, columnist Richard Duterte, the author of Asia's New Battlefield. Welcome back to the show. Also joining us from the Philippines capital, Wilson Lee Flores, columnist for the daily newspaper, The Philippine Star. Thanks for being with us. From London, Sharif El-Jabai, director of the Center for Study of International Peace and Security. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
And from Washington, Zachary Abusa, who teaches Southeast Asia politics and security at the National War College. Thank you for joining the France 24 debate.
Thank you for having me.
The France 24 debate on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. It's been a week since militants overran Marawi city. 90% of its 200,000 citizens are said to have fled, mostly to nearby Iligan city, both on the island of Mindanao, base for radical groups that include the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters, Abu Sayyaf, and the Maute group, the latter which overran Marawi. Josh Vardy has more.
I am going to create a new division for you. Para sa inyo. Wala nang qualification. Total, marunong naman kayo magbaril. Practice lang kayo ng kalabit. I am willing to take you, soldiers of the Republic. Lahat. MI, MN, pati NPA. Para ang sundalo ko halo-halo. Ngayon, yung mga lugar na master ninyo, doon kayo maghanap ng kalaban.
More from President Duterte later and react to that. First, let's get that report by Josh Vardy. All right, we'll try to go to that report by Josh Vardy a little bit later on. Let's get reactions now. First of all, Richard Duterte, what do you make of the latest right now we're getting from inside of that we're getting from inside of the areas around Marawi City? Word that for now there is still house-to-house fighting going on, and that there are still insurgents holding out. What are you hearing? All right, we'll try to go to Richard Hadarian a little bit later on. Apologies for that. Zakaria Buza in Washington, what do you make of this takeover of the first of all, this shock that we saw 8 days ago with this parade of motorcycles in Marawi City with flying the black flag of ISIS?
The Maute group has been building up their forces for a couple years now in nearby region of this, so it's really no surprise. They are one of many groups that have pledged allegiance to the Islamic State in the southern Philippines. And part of the logic, it took this group, they declared allegiance in 2014. Such recognition was not returned by the Islamic State until early 2016. So there's always been a bit of competition amongst these groups for primacy. And I think the Maute group saw an opportunity to engage in violence against the state to burnish its position.
To burnish its position, and it sounds as though this attempt to capture this commander who's on whose head there was a $5 million bounty by the FBI backfired miserably.
Yes, and there's a long history in the Philippines of tactical raids having strategic consequences. In January 2015, there was a raid against another terrorist by Philippine security forces that led to the unraveling of the peace agreement with the much larger Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And it's very possible that the Philippine military was led into an ambush. It's certainly within the realm of possibilities here. But the peace process with the MILF unraveling has really had very important consequences to the rise of groups like the Maute group, because the MILF controls the territory surrounding Marawi City, and they've given these groups, these black flag groups, sanctuary. Without a peace process for them to without a peace process with the government, they really have nothing to offer their rank-and-file combatants who are feeling very let down and disaffected, and it plays into the narrative of these hardline groups.
Yeah, let's bring in Richard Hadarian on this. Richard, clear this up for us, because there are groups with which President Duterte is negotiating, and groups against which he's opposed. You heard there a moment ago Zakaria Buza mentioning black flag groups. There seems to be some kind of alliance. Who's in charge of what?
Well, as far as President Duterte is concerned, I think his biggest mistake in his first 10 months in office was just to obsessively focus on one issue and one issue alone, and that is his war on drugs. Now, it is unfair to say that he didn't care about peace process or didn't care about Mindanao. Remember, the communist rebels are also one of the major insurgencies in Mindanao. And Mr. Duterte focused on the peace process, but vis-a-vis the communist rebels. That's where much of the energy of Jesus Dureza, his peace negotiator, and Silvestre Bellio, he's also other peace negotiator and Department of Labor minister, was focused on, while he was not paying as much attention to the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, a 12,000 strong insurgency, which was at the center of negotiations with the Philippine government under the Aquino administration, until the negotiations entered the dangerous stage of hibernation after the Mamasapana tragedy in January 2015, which your earlier guest was talking about. And then, of course, you have this aspect of Duterte actually doubling down on his old established personal ties with people like Nur Miswari, who actually launched a similar attack like the one in Marawi on Zamboanga City in 2013. So in short, President Duterte was not really that much focused on patching things up, pushing forward the peace negotiations, getting the Bangsamoro Basic Law passed, and really focusing his peace efforts on the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. And the result of that is that it created this kind of peace vacuum that is increasingly being exploited by extremist groups. Now, add to that, this is where we have to be fair to Duterte, he should not be blamed for that, is the ISIS or Daesh pivot to the east as they get pounded in Mosul and in the coming months probably in Raqqa. So they're also looking at relocating, at finding alternative havens. This was the case in the 1990s when Al-Qaeda was relocating to Southeast Asia, when Jamaat Islamiyah was establishing bases in Mindanao. So we're seeing a new phase of this. And it seems now, finally, President Duterte recognizes that this problem could get out of control. And that's why, in fact, his martial law has been broadly supported by the public and much of the Congress and the Philippine political establishment.
Yeah, that's a point I want to touch on with you. Sherry Felgebele, you've been writing about this, the fact that as ISIS is on the back foot in places like Syria and Iraq, Southeast Asia can expect an attraction. And we've seen over the past 24 hours, authorities in the Philippines saying there are foreign fighters there in Marawi.
Yes, that's right. So the Philippine Solicitor General has already reported that there are individuals from neighboring countries, from Malaysia and from Indonesia. But I think what's important to recognize is that irrespective of what's going on in the Middle East or in Afghanistan, the nature of Islamist extremism requires a breeding ground. And so really what needs to happen in the Philippines is a focus, of course, first and foremost to establish the security situation. But then in the aftermath, I think really there needs to be a stronger focus on the underlying roots and the root causes of the kind of attraction to Islamist extremism. These things like poverty, unemployment, and a variety of other social factors.
And as Zachary Abuza was mentioning at the outset, a bit of a power vacuum.
Right. Yes. So precisely. I mean, it's this idea that you need to engage with the local population, that you can't simply leave them without or ostracized from the political process, even if there is a certain degree of autonomy within that particular region. There needs to be better engagement from the government on a variety of levels. And that, I think, is going to be a major challenge.
Better engagement with the local population. We saw and we heard it at the outset there. President Duterte offering the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, the Moro National Liberation Front, to integrate them as soldiers with same pay, same privileges. I will build houses for you in some areas, he said. Wilson Lee Flores, let me ask you, is this a bit premature to be offering insurgents with which there are still negotiations going on, integration into the army?
I think as long as they could really accept the terms of the government, I think as long as they will really follow the president and the rules of the national government, I think it will be reasonable and not a problem to welcome them, because I think the government now is perceived by the people and even by the politicians to be really strong-willed. We have a government that has strong will, and there are a lot of military and police forces there. So I think it's not premature because it's not too much a problem, because if you don't integrate them, they will be unemployed and they will be maybe causing crimes and all these things. I think the good thing about this President Duterte, he is a local guy from Mindanao. For the first time in Philippine history, we have a national leader that is a local guy. And he even said that one of his ancestors was partly Muslim. So a lot of people trust his judgment. I think his judgment is based on actual local experience. So
how far it can go. So two things in what you're saying. I want Richard Hederian to rebound on them. On the one hand, here you have a president who is from Mindanao, from Davao City, and so who's closer to the area. And on the other hand, you heard saying it is possible to integrate them. Again, we heard at the outset President Duterte is saying, just practice pulling the trigger. I'm willing to take you as soldiers of the Republic. Is that going to work? Richard
Is this question
Haidarian?
to me? Okay. Well, I mean, one of the things we have to keep in mind is that definitely President Duterte, I think his heart is Mindanao. His legacy he wants his legacy to be peace and development in Mindanao. In fact, a lot of his good relations with China has to do with China's offer of major infrastructure investment in Mindanao. But sometimes that familiarity that brings some sort of complacency. I think President Duterte thought in his first 10 months, just because he has a background, a moral background, that he's from Mindanao, he can just, take the issue of peace negotiations for granted. And I think now he has realized that he has to translate that personalistic advantages into actually a much more systematic and institutionalized approach, because you cannot just rely on personal bonds to get very complicated issues like peace negotiations and counterterrorism going on. The second thing you have to keep in mind is that it also matters what the military thinks. And I'm not sure the military is very comfortable of fully integrating former rebels, former enemies, for some of them even current enemies, into their rank and file. So Duterte will also have to take into consideration what the military thinks. And I think if you look at all key issues, whether it's foreign policy, relations with China, with Russia, with the United States, the Philippine military is very influential. And on many occasions, Duterte had to walk back his initial statement precisely because he had to take into consideration the sentiments of the military. And then the third interesting thing here is that this morning it was revealed, and I actually had conversation with this person. Defense Minister Delfin Lorenzana said that perhaps martial law is not even necessary, and that even if a martial law has been declared, we have to make sure that this martial law doesn't trample upon the basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of the people. I mean, Secretary Lorenzo just told me this today, that they're going to make sure that Marcos-era abuses will not happen. So a lot of internal dynamics going on there, and we should not just be bound and confined to Duterte's statements, which are sometimes very controversial and very unorthodox.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me a little bit of what's going on in your country, Zachary Abuza, the United States, where you sort of have to separate the rhetoric from the reality when it comes to Donald Trump. With Rodrigo Duterte, how much did you take him at his word when he talks about integrating other insurgents into the army?
I think he talks without thinking. This is a very complicated process. They tried this back in 1996 when they had a peace agreement with the Moro National Liberation Front. Very few of those combatants were actually integrated, and it took a piece of legislation to make it happen, and the military, as Richard said, really resisted this. So I think he's getting way ahead of himself. He declared martial law without really thinking through the consequences or having a strategy. And the strategy has to come back. And again, I completely agree with what Richard said about having a holistic approach to the peace process with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front. They are the largest force in the region, and they are a key stakeholder. And until they have a peace process that Duterte is willing to use his political capital and push through Congress, they have no incentive to be a real honest broker in this. And that's troubling. But they certainly have a key role to play in delivering peace to the region. No group has more influence than they do.
All right, we're going to pick up on this martial law, good idea or not. We've been asking you on the hashtag F24 debate. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues. Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the Philippines in a state of martial law. This as ISIS-affiliated militants last week stormed the city of Marawi, that is in the southern Mindanao Island. And with us to talk about it from Manila, columnist Richard Haidarian, the author of Asia's New Battlefield. Welcome back as well from the Philippines capital, Wilson Lee Flores, a columnist with daily newspaper The Philippine Star from London, Sharif El Gabeli, director of the Center for Study of International Peace, and from Washington, Zachary Abuza of the National War College. We were talking before the break about the fact that being on the back foot in places like the Middle East has meant that we have seen militants flock to Southeast Asia, not just, by the way, to the Philippines. We had last week an attack in Jakarta that left 3 policemen dead. Let me ask you about this. Sheriff El Gabeli, we're seeing, again, according to authorities from the Philippines, that there are militants from places like Indonesia, like Malaysia, like Singapore that are engaged in the battle. My question to you is, can ISIS militants actually hold territory in a place like the Philippines?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, and it remains to be seen. I think that they will gain popularity with any disproportionate response by a government. And I think that that's why it's so important for Duterte to exercise that principle of proportionality in his response and to ensure that he doesn't undermine any standards of human rights or permit any of the soldiers that are implementing the martial law to commit any violations. We mentioned earlier, I think, that he jokingly referred to allowing soldiers to commit acts of rape, and I think that that in itself is an abhorrent statement. Whether it's a joke or not, I think that it has no place being stated, even if it is a joke. That, I think, opens a door that will be very difficult to shut, because it's quite clear that even the smallest number of violations will be held to the light and will be held up as models and examples as to how the Philippines is no longer safe for the Muslim minority. It's important, I think, also to recall that the majority of Muslims in the Philippines do reside in this region, and that's around 94%. And we're talking about over 5 million people here. The isolation of these people, I think, can play into the hands of Islamist extremists, simply for the fact that they will feel persecuted. There will be certain oversteps of the mark or of the line, and if the Philippine government is not careful in ensuring that they act in a proportionate manner and in a way that is compliant with what human rights cannot be derogated from, then there will be, of course, some quite severe repercussions.
Yeah, the Philippines president, as you were saying, employing his trademark Duterte Harry swagger in an off-the-cuff remark that shocked many. Let's take a listen.
If you go down, I go down. But for this martial law and the consequences of martial law and the ramifications of martial law, I and I alone would be responsible. Trabaho lang kayo. Panabala. Ako na ang magpakulong sa inyo. Pag nagka-rape ka ng 3, aminin ko na akin yun.
Richard Idarid, what are the consequences of a remark like that one?
Well, this is exactly the first time whereby Duterte has made, some sort of off-the-cuff statement. I mean, there's no excuse for what he said. I mean, this is a very sensitive, issue. I mean, we're talking about Muslim community whereby, any sexual harassment of women is extremely big issue, because it means you're dishonoring the entire clan and family. So I think for someone like Duterte, who claims to have moral background, who is from Mindanao, that was definitely uncalled for. But I think he was taken by the gravity of the moment. I think he really wanted to show that he's there with the military through and through. And if you look at it, the off-the-cuff statements came towards the end when he was kind of changing his tone and trying to just drop some jokes. And I think maybe a combination of exhaustion and lack of, proper care with his language explains that. But definitely there's no excuse for that kind of language. Now, the other thing we have to keep in mind is, by the way, not the entire Philippines is under martial law.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Richard, is this 60 days of martial law for the south of the country justified?
Well, my point is that the government is yet to provide a very specific report. Per the Philippine Constitution, the president has to do that. He has to forward a specific report justifying why there is, because the only way for you to declare martial law is if there is a state of rebellion or a state of invasion. Now, the government is saying is that both things are happening. You have invasion because you have foreign fighters what I'm hearing on the ground is that there are also possibly Arab fighters, not only Indonesian or Malaysian, which is worrying a lot of people. So you see tremendous internationalization of the dispute. They're also saying this is a rebellion. Nonetheless, of course, just 4 years ago in 2013, there was also a massive siege on the city of Zamboanga, led by some splinter faction of MNLF, and the government did not declare martial law in Mindanao. The same way with President Estrada, with President Ramos in the 90s and early 2000s, similar situation happened, but they did not declare martial law. Perhaps the reason they declared martial law this time was that they realized that perhaps the president and the government needs more legal leeway to deal with the problem of ISIS. I mean, the Philippines is not yet on the level of Boko Haram or Nigeria, whereby you have a potent ISIS affiliate groups actually controlling territory and huge population. But I think the martial law was a preemptive measure in order to prevent that. But I think the moment Duterte tries to extend the martial law beyond Mindanao to Visayas and the Manila region, I think that's where he's going to get the resistance, including from within his own alliance, his own supermajority in the Congress, and from the military.
Wilson Lee Flores, let me ask you, this declaration of martial law, we even heard Duterte hint that perhaps it could be extended to the rest of the country. Is that justified?
I doubt it would extend beyond Mindanao because the main problem is in parts of Mindanao only, not even in the entire Mindanao region. And I think earlier, I'd like to mention earlier, Richard said that the problem is not only the President Duterte also. I think the good thing about martial law is he could, after this martial law thing, he could go negotiate with the rebels from a position of strength. I think because the government, I think he is sincere in his efforts to negotiate with the communists and the Muslim rebels, but showing this strong response to rebellion and terrorism will strengthen his hand. And I think about the concern about the military, as long as the president supports them strongly and you have a decisive president with a clear policy and strategic objectives, I think the support of the military will be very strong. And I heard among the rank and file, many of the military people like him. And I think his popularity is stronger than even past Philippine presidents before. So I really doubt martial law will go all the way to Manila. I think it will be confined to Mindanao and not for a very long period of time.
Zachary Abuza, of course, the declaration of martial law for people, that conjures memories of 1972 when the Philippine strongman at the time, Ferdinand Marcos, decreed it. It lasted for more than a decade, and it was the pretext for a bloody crackdown. Is it unfair to compare Duterte to Marcos?
Not at all. He emulates Marcos. He spoke as much when he was a candidate for presidency. He was very quick to inter the remains of the former president in the Heroes Cemetery, despite public opposition. He's been warning for 2 years now that he intended would look to declaring martial law to solve the country's problems. I should note that the situation in Mindanao got much worse under Marcos when he declared martial law, and I do not think that there's any justification to declare martial law right now, and I think it's going to be quite counterproductive. You are going to see
But you just heard Wilson Lee Flores saying that he's got the backing of the army and he's more popular than ever.
Wait until you start to see the abuses of human rights. You've already had 8,000 people gunned down through extrajudicial killings by security forces in his war on drugs. There are going to be excesses in this campaign. The Philippine military has no experience in urban street-to-street combat. This could go south very quickly. They've engaged in shelling from the air and artillery shelling from a distance. into urban areas. This is not helpful. This is not going to help the security situation in the long run. And might I remind you that the Philippine military still remains very dependent on U.S. military assistance and sales. With the declaration of martial law, there are now going to be congressional restrictions. We've already seen holds on some sales of military weapons to the police because of their involvement in these extrajudicial killings in the war on drugs. This is going to be very counterproductive to the Philippine military's long-term interests.
Sherry Felgabelli, it sounds like a familiar story. It's very difficult for countries to get a grip on counterinsurgency.
Yes, that's right. I think it's immensely difficult once Islamist extremism has taken a hold, particularly in areas, as I mentioned before, where there's poverty. This is something that we've seen across the board, really, in a variety of Middle Eastern states, and we're seeing it now in a few of the Asian states as well, Southeast Asia. Certainly, the draw or the attraction of Islamist extremism is far more alluring to those who have nothing else to live for. And there are a wealth of reasons why people join extremist groups like Daesh or their affiliates. But certainly, I think research has shown us quite clearly that there are certain environments in which that type of extremism is very willingly accepted. We've seen it in Tunisia, we've seen it in Syria, in Iraq, and now in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and certainly in the Philippines in the south. Just touching on the previous point that was made, I think that I would agree wholeheartedly with it. I would add also that the south of the Philippines is heavily reliant on agriculture, and that shelling and military intervention in the south of the Philippines is very likely to actually decimate large areas of that, which is just going to spiral the area into further chaos and further poverty, because people will not be able to make ends meet. And as I've said, that will then have a seriously negative impact on security and on peace in the area.
Richard Idarian, another point that was brought up there by Zachary Abuza, the Philippines military relying heavily on the U.S. military. What's going to be the relationship going forward between Washington and Manila?
Well, I think Wilson was right that Duterte has some popularity among the rank and file, but I mean, the reality is that there are two reasons why I don't think the military will welcome a martial law across the country beyond Mindanao, or even an extended martial law in Mindanao. One is ideological. Since the fall of the Marcos dictatorship, you have a lot of new doctrines coming into the military. I think there has been an ideological embrace the basic democratic principles of the Philippine Constitution. And remember, the military's task is to defend the Philippine Constitution, not necessarily just follow blindly the president. So that's one thing you have to keep in mind. But there are, I think Zachary put it very correctly, there are also material consideration. 75% of the total weaponries of the armed forces of the Philippines comes from only one country, and that is the United States. A lot of the leading officials, including former President Ramos, who is also advisor of Duterte, are graduates of American universities like the West Point. So training is there, money comes from America, and in terms of high-grade intelligence, the United States is the leading country in the world that can provide that to Duterte. Duterte cannot count on countries like China and Russia, which are struggling to deal with the problems in Xinjiang and Chechnya themselves. So I think this is where Duterte will be increasingly pushed to patch up differences with the Trump administration, which, by the way, has been very supportive towards Duterte. President Trump has been almost sympathetic to Duterte's war on drugs. He has been mum on human rights issues. And just after the declaration of martial law in Mindanao, he said that America is a quote-unquote proud ally of the Philippines and will provide all necessary counterterrorism assistance. And in the coming months, it's almost certain that Duterte and Trump are going to meet each other. It's not clear whether twice or once. What I knew initially was that there was a plan to visit the White House by Duterte earlier than November, probably September, October. But that plan is now under question. But clearly in November, during the East Asia Summit, Trump confirm his visit to Manila, and that's where they're going to have a bilateral summit. So I think the gravity of the problem in Mindanao and the gravity of the counterterrorism concern is going to push Duterte to patch up differences with the United States. And then, of course, the necessity for investing in peace process and development in Mindanao will force him to reconsider his earlier rejection of European Union grants. Up to $300 million of European Union grants are also now hanging in the balance because of Duterte's disagreement with Western countries over human rights issues. He now has to revisit all of those.
And when Zachary Abuza says that Duterte emulates Ferdinand Marcos, how far does that go? The opposition saying that he's got the makings, the trappings of somebody who could be a dictator.
Well, I mean, the specter of a Marcosian authoritarianism is perhaps there. I mean, you cannot deny that. And the president's incendiary rhetoric sometimes doesn't really help in terms of, calming down anxieties. But the fact of the matter is that the conditions are very different. Perhaps I'm being over-optimistic, but the reality is that this is a different military we're talking about compared to the 1970s. This is a military that is recovering from the horrors of martial law, which also undermines its own credibility. The second thing is, by the way, it took Marcos years before he could bribe the entire military to go with him. And it took a lot of investment in the military and increasing defense spending for him to get that. As far as Duterte is concerned, his popularity among the rank and file is because of his sincerity and his character. And I think that's the reason why. It's not because he has really increased their basic benefits and bonuses and salary. He promised to do so, but that hasn't happened. So I think there are many factors for us to say that the probability for a nationwide martial law or resuscitation of a Marcosian dictatorship is very, very low. But as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat itself, but sometimes it rhymes.
Wilson Lee Flores, you agree?
So I missed some parts of it, but I think he's correct that martial law wouldn't be the same because Marcos' era, that was the time when the whole of Asia was authoritarian. Everywhere from South Korea, Park Chung-hee, to Malaysia, Thailand, everyone in Asia, almost everyone was under authoritarian rule. Now it's no longer the same conditions, and the Philippines has already gone through that era. It's like a genie that has already gone out, the democracy. I don't think we can go back to that situation again. It's very far-fetched, and it's like, I think it will be totally different. I see Duterte as a strong leader within a very strongly democratic society. Even with martial law in Mindanao, the courts there are all functioning. The free press in Mindanao area and in the Philippines is very vibrant, very critical. Our media very alive. So I don't see martial law, Marcos style, coming back under Duterte.
Don't see it coming back under Duterte. Zachary Abuza, because we're almost out of time. Are you reassured?
No, I'm not. I don't think this is going to help at all. The Philippines has a host of security challenges, and it just takes leadership. And the president has not been focused on the security situation in Mindanao. He has been focused on these extrajudicial killings and his war on drugs. It's time for him to really take the lead and push through the peace process with the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and slowly take apart these black flag groups. But it's not going to be done through the suspension of the rule of law.
All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, Zachary Abuza, for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Sharif El-Gabeli in London, Richard Haidarian, and Wilson Lee Flores in Manila. Stay with us because our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon.
Hi, Francois.
Differing points of view there on whether or not Rodrigo Duterte is another Ferdinand Marcos in the making in the Philippines. Of course, a lot of reactions to what's been going on the last 8 days.
That's right. It is generating comments on social media, as you would expect. And just to, obviously, there's a whole range of different comments. I've just been looking in English. And here's a look at some of those various remarks on social media. Some, over the last week or so, linking the terrible attack in Manchester with what's happening happening in Marawi, and indeed with ISIS claiming responsibility, or at least being involved in some way, shape or form in both of those terrible incidents, which are very different incidents in very different parts of the world. People are linking that on social media. Pray for Manchester, pray for Marawi, with a message in this particular tweet saying that ISIS do not follow Islam. Islam is a religion of peace. So that's one sort of theme. I've seen a lot of tweets mentioning Manchester and Marawi together.
Interesting.
Elsewhere, we're seeing various Twitter accounts relaying photos of what has been happening over the last week. Here you have one image showing ongoing fighting in downtown areas of Marawi between Islamic terrorists and security forces. I'll show you some of these images and then I'll give you, I suppose, a comment on them. Army Marines have seized a number of weapons and ammo from IS-linked #Maute group. You can see images there purporting to be from the Islamic State organization. Islamic State group. Here again on the same Twitter account, which is called @TerrorEvents. It has over 18,000 followers and relays information about terror attacks around the world. Not a very, I suppose, joyous Twitter account, but that's its stated purpose. And here in this tweet, Islamic State-linked militants are forcing local Christians to convert to Islam. That is a report that we heard elsewhere as well, of course. And Islamic State supporters spreading pictures of the situation in the city, large numbers of buildings set on fire. Now, what I would say about these images is this claims these photos are supposedly taken by Islamic State supporters who are then uploading them online as pro-Islamic State propaganda. We only have the word of this particular Twitter account to go on for that. It's not a news agency. We can't be certain of the source of these photos or whether or not they indeed originate in Marawi. So there is a big potential for disinformation and misinformation on a story like this. And just to give you a concrete example of how that can play out, there were images relayed by the Philippines news agency showing images that supposedly were taking place in Marawi with the army intervening. The Filipino news agency was forced to retract that image because, in fact, it came from an incident that happened in Vietnam. So here you have a sort of a mea culpa, an admission of error by the PNA, saying that the Vietnam photo was used in the Marawi story. But perhaps they would not have made that mea culpa unless they were called on it. It looks like they were just using any old photo to illustrate the story. So that is an example of the extent to which stories like this coming out of Marawi, where there isn't a huge news infrastructure or presence, are liable to be somewhat misrepresented on social media, certainly in terms of images.
It's fascinating because there's two things you're saying there. On the one hand, once again, people in a rush to get stuff out before verifying it.
Right.
And also there's the war on the ground and the war that's taking place on social media.
That's right. So social media, as ever, it is not the most reliable source of news. It's a very rich source of news, but it needs to be verified. And we have some examples here of where either there's a question mark hanging over the authenticity of photos, or some photos have in fact been proven not to be authentic. There's also a lot of all-out conspiracy theories regarding this story on social media. I won't necessarily relay that.
No,
but there's a lot. If you type Philippines into social media, you're having conspiracy theories about Duterte having kicked out the head of the central bank, and that this is some shadowy conspiracy by the West to put Islamic State in response. So that's, I suppose, the nth degree of disinformation that you're also finding on social media. So to be taken with, what would you say, caution when you go on social media in terms of searching for information about these stories.
And thankfully, there's a vibrant press that is alive and well in the Philippines, which we can rely on, which we have been relying on for a lot of our information. James Creedon, many thanks for that. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.